Okay, welcome to our second Zoom meeting of theories of personality. As I told you during our first meeting, I am Dr. Freddie Aviles. Today we'll be talking about, we'll be going over chapter 1 or our first lecture, which doesn't cover a specific personality theory. It's just setting us up, defining personality, talking a little bit about how personality is assessed or measured, and a little bit about research, a little bit about theory. So let's get started. Defining personality. How do we define personality? Okay. Actually, I'm not providing you guys with a definition because how we define personality actually depends. It actually depends on what theory you are talking about. Is it psychoanalytic theory, which is Freud's theory? Is it, Skinner's theory of personality, which is based on behaviorism? So personality is defined differently depending on what theory you're talking about. According to Skinner, for instance, who was a behaviorist, to him, personality is nothing more than a pattern of behavior. That could be a definition of personality. But Freud would define it differently. But I'll save what Freud said for later because that's the next chapter we're going to talk about. So it really depends. I could give you a very simple definition of personality, my personal one. That's not based on anybody's theory, but my own personal one based on my understanding as a psychologist. Personality is basically a pattern of thinking, feeling, and behaving. Personality is about who you are, and who you are has to do with how you think, how you feel, and how you behave. And it's that over time. It's a pattern of that. That's your personality. So it's not that one time that you were shy because you had to give a presentation in class and you had stage fright, so to speak. That doesn't mean you're shy. That was a situational thing. But if we see a pattern that you're shy in class, you're shy at work, you are shy in many circumstances, right? Many situations, that would imply that you actually are shy, that is a pattern, that is part of your personality. So that's my simple definition for you guys. A pattern of thinking, feeling, and behaving. That's one way to define personality. For if you want a standard kind of definition that you might see in a, Psych 101 class, okay? So if how we define personality depends on the theory, then let's talk about what theories are. A theory is, it says here, is a framework for simplifying and describing data that allows for new predictions. That's one definition of a theory. There are several, but they all say more or less the same thing. You might have heard other definitions of theories. A theory is, according to other definitions, is basically an explanation of something that allows for new predictions. A theory is basically, is basically just, an explanation of the data, an explanation of the evidence, okay? And that also allows us, to basically come up with new data, allows us to do more research and test new ideas and new hypotheses. So I've given you a couple of definitions there of a theory, but there's one written there for you guys. So theories try to explain things. They try to simplify things, okay? So personality is probably not a simple thing. It's probably complicated. Theories try to put that in a way that makes sense. They try to explain that. And if it's a good theory, a theory would also lead to us making predictions, okay? And here's some examples of theories. Psychodynamic theory, which is Freud's theory. I won't define it for you now, but because that's the next chapter. Humanistic theory, social learning theory. There's the theory of behaviorism. There are many. Pretty much almost every theory that we're going to talk about, will be different. Okay. Some are similar actually. Some of these personality theories that we're going to talk about, some of them fall under humanistic theory. But they're all different in their own way. Okay. But there are some commonalities among some of them. So like for instance, there's a set of theories that we'll call neo-psychoanalytic theories. They're all similar to Freud's theory in a way, okay? But Freud's is the psychodynamic theory, or based on psychoanalytic theory. Okay, so I've said more about theory than I wanted to, but just to give you an explanation there about what a theory is. I want to point something else out before I forget. Notice the PowerPoint slide number there is 0. When you download the PowerPoint slide in Slides in Canvas, it'll actually have the right numbers. When I present on my iPad, for some reason, it changes the numbers to zeros. Sometimes it moves the bullets around, it moves the pictures around a little bit, so sometimes the words will be cut off. But when you download it and look at it on your own, it will look right. Okay, I just wanted to point that out. When I use a laptop, when I get that new laptop, we won't have that issue. Okay. More about defining personality. This is something that I've read, something I want to share with you guys. According to research, right? Research done by Fisk in 2004. That's the way you cite, by the way, in APA style, author's last name, comma, then the year in parentheses at the end. There's another way to do it, but that's one way to give credit to the author. According to Fisk, a good theory should meet the following criteria. A good theory should posit causal relationships. So in other words, a good theory should tell you what causes what, right? So if somebody has an aggressive personality, a good theory should tell you what causes that aggressive behavior or what causes shyness. It should talk about cause and effect, okay? A good theory should be coherent. What that means is that it makes sense, okay? It shouldn't be overly complicated. It shouldn't be all convoluted, okay? A good theory, according to Fisk, also tells a good story. They are informative. They are, somewhat entertaining in a way, okay? And a good theory is parsimonious, okay? A good theory explains phenomena or explains things as simply as possible. That also, relates to the other things we're talking about, like being coherent, telling a good story. The story should be as simple as possible, okay? You shouldn't try to explain things in a way that's too complicated. There's a saying that says that if something is overly complicated, it's probably wrong. That doesn't always work, though. There are some things that are more complicated the more we learn about them, okay? But good theories should not be more complicated than we need to be. I'll give you an example of something that is not really a theory, it's more of an idea, okay? But some people talk about theories and ideas as if they're the same things. Theories and ideas are not the same thing. An idea is just something that you may believe or an opinion of something or something that you say. A theory is something that is actually an idea or an explanation of something that is actually backed up by evidence. But let me give you an example of an idea. And the people who proposed this idea might want to call it a theory, but it's not a theory. Some of you, maybe all of you, have probably heard of something known as Scientology. Scientology tries to explain why we are the way we are. To some extent, it tries to explain personality and why you feel the way you do. It's supposed to be a type of religion, to tell you the truth, based on science. But it's actually not based on real science. It's more of a pseudoscience. It's a fake science. It's not real science. And those ideas don't qualify. The explanation doesn't really qualify as a theory because there's no evidence for that. And it's overly complicated, this idea. Their explanation for why you feel the way you do and why you are the way you are has something to do with aliens and volcanoes and things that happen, like billions of years ago, and all this complicated nonsense. The guy who created Scientologists, by the way, was a science fiction writer, okay? So he made up all kinds of stuff like that. And he decided to create his own religion. Probably, to tell you the truth, probably for tax purposes, because religions or churches aren't taxed, okay? So I'm very, kind of pessimistic about the intentions of this whole Scientology thing. But just to give you an example, their ideas are overly complicated, okay? Not good at all. Probably not the way things really work, okay? A good theory is also testable, okay? It's testable. And just to pick on Scientology again, and I'm sorry if there is a Scientologist in the audience, okay? My opinion is that that's not based on real science. It's not really a real religion, okay? But a good theory should also be testable, You can't test stuff that has to do with aliens that lived billions of years ago and all this stuff that they talk about. But you can test these theories. You can test aspects of behaviorism. You can test aspects of Freud's theory, although it's not completely testable. There are some parts that are, okay? But a good theory should be testable. If you can't test what the theory says, then it's not a good theory, okay? I mean, it's just something that people believe, and you can't subject it to scientific scrutiny. A good theory will generate many hypotheses. A good theory will lead to basically ideas, other ideas that you can test. So this theory suggests that people who are basically extroverted would be well suited for jobs, let's say, that require leadership or require working in groups, things like that. You know, you can test those ideas, okay? A good theory also solves problems. A good theory doesn't just explain how things work, but because it explains how things work, it also allows us to solve problems. Like, for instance, Bandura's theory, based on social learning, doesn't just explain how we learn things and why we believe and become the way we are, but it also allows us to develop therapies based on social learning. Therapies to help people get better, therapies to help people overcome things like shyness and awkwardness and all kinds of things. And so does Freud's theory. Freud's theory also, basically has what's called psychoanalysis. Psychoanalysis is a part of psychoanalytic theory, right? It's a therapy based on the theory. And so do many of these theories that we're going to talk about. A lot of them also have been developed as forms of therapy. Their authors also developed the form of therapy. A lot of these early theories, the authors were actual therapists, or basically Freud was a psychiatrist. So they solve problems. That's what a good theory does according to Fisk, okay? Now, let's talk about, that's a little bit about theory and defining personality. Now let's talk about assessment. How do you actually measure somebody's personality? How do you assess it? How do you evaluate it? So we're going to talk about these assessment methods. Assessment methods help us evaluate, measure, determine somebody's personality, whatever you want to call it. And a lot of these you probably have heard of. Self-reports, for instance. Self-reports are another way to talk about self-reports. Another thing to call them is it's a questionnaire. A self-report asks people to fill out questions about their behavior, about their feelings, about what they think. That's what self-reports are, okay? Now, there are many self-reports, many different types of questionnaires, okay? I can tell you about some complicated ones. There's the MMPI, the Minnesota, that stands for the Minnesota Multiphasic Personality Inventory. The CPI, I think that stands for the California Personality Inventory. And there's many others, many other basically surveys, questionnaires, whatever you want to call them, that have been developed, okay, that try to assess personality. Strengths, so what's good about these? The scoring of these self-reports is usually objective, okay? The scoring is determined ahead of time that, you know, we're going to score the questions this way, and if you get this many of this type, then it means you have this personality. Or if you have a lower score, then it means that you're this personality. So yes, the scoring has been determined, and in a somewhat scientific way. These self-reports can also be cheap to administer. Some of them are available for free. They're not all cheap, actually, by the way. The MMPI and the CPI, you actually have to pay for those if you want to administer those. And you might want to do that if you are, let's say, an employer for a large corporation, and you want to only hire people who have a certain kind of personality. Then they might pay the company to develop these self-reports to give them to the people who are applying. And that will not be cheap. That will cost a lot of money. The MMPI actually takes like 3 hours to fill out. So I think it's a couple of $100, I think, per person, what it costs to, to pay for that. They can be done quickly and easy. Not all of them, but most surveys are short and are very easy to fill out Some of them, like the MMPI, are long and not easy to fill out, okay? So usually self-reports are quick and easy, but not all of them, okay? Weaknesses, these self-reports, do have their problems. They can suffer from bias on the part of those that are filling them out. Those that are filling them out can lie about themselves and claim that they're good at this or that or whatever it is, that they're not aggressive, that they're kind. People can lie, okay? Or people can sometimes be lazy and fill out these questionnaires randomly. Just, click, click, click if you're doing it online, or circle here, circle there, 1 through 5, on the scale, and can basically give they just can give data that's erroneous, basically. Of course, not only bias, sometimes you're not aware of that you have a bias, and you can show that on a self-report, but you can also be just outright dishonest and lie and say you're a female rather than a male, or say that, let's say you're straight, when you're actually not, or people can be dishonest on these things. They fill them out themselves. Now, I will tell you that there are some self-reports that are actually very sophisticated and that try to determine if people are lying. And again, that is the MMPI. It has questions in there to determine if you're biased, right? If you're trying to present yourself in a certain way that you're not, if you're just outright being dishonest. There are questions built into the test that will catch you if you're lying. And that's why it also can be useful for employers. Okay, so that's some information there about self-reports. That can include surveys, questionnaires, things like that. That's one way you can assess personality. You can also use projective tests. Maybe you've heard of this from Psych 101. Projective tests are very interesting. They're fun. Projective tests are based on the idea that we project unconscious aspects of personality onto ambiguous stimuli. Let me explain that. Projective tests are based on that Freudian idea that there are things hidden in our unconscious mind, things that we're not aware of, that actually determine who we are and what our personality is. Okay, and when we say something based on these tests, we're actually saying something that's coming from the unconscious. It'll become clear when I show you some examples. So an example would be the Rorschach. That's the test that uses those ink blots, okay, that I'll show you in a moment. I'll show you a few in a moment, or maybe one. The TAT, the thematic apperception test, which shows you an image and you have to make up a story. And there's others. There is the sentence completion test. There is the draw a picture test. The draw a picture test, you draw a person test. You draw a person, and the way you draw the person is supposed to say something about your personality. And those are all projective tests. As you may notice, they sound kind of fun, okay? Strengths, what's good about these tests? They tap the unconscious. If you believe in the unconscious, these tests are designed to bring those things that are hidden out into the open. And according to the makers of these tests, or the theories that they're based on, your personality is due to things that are hidden. It's due to things in the unconscious, to your unconscious mind. So these tests are designed to bring that out. Like I said, these tests are fun, okay? Because they usually involve pictures or other things that are fun. Weaknesses, these tests, they have been criticized for not being very objective. In other words, what is what personality you're gonna have, or the person who's giving you the test, the personality that they're gonna say you have is gonna be based on what they think the test says about you. So if one person gives you the test and you give your responses, they might say one thing about your personality. If another person gives you the test, they might say something completely different. So the test is kind of subjective. It depends on how the person interprets what you're saying, the person who's giving you the test. And there's also interpretation bias, okay? The person who is interpreting what you say is gonna be biased based on their theoretical orientation. If they're Freudian, they're gonna interpret things one way. If they are not Freudian, and instead, let's say they believe in, let's say, Karen Horney's theory, then they'll interpret the things you say differently, and your score will be different. Research has shown that these tests are not reliable. You can take it once, take it a second time, and you'll get very different, you'll give different responses, you'll get different results. The tests have been criticized for not being valid, that they don't actually measure personality. So the tests are not reliable. The scores vary from, even if the same person takes the same test more than once, the outcome will be different. So it's not even reliable. And it's not valid. According to those that have researched these tests, they don't really measure personality. They could be measuring something you just saw. So let's say you look at an image like this, right? This is an image based on the Rorschach. And those that give you the test might ask you, okay, what does this look like to you? And what matters is the first thing that pops into your mind. What does that look like to you? And I might say, I see a big tough guy riding a motorcycle, okay? And that might imply to the person who's testing me that maybe I'm a tough guy, or maybe I'm adventurous, something like that. But maybe it doesn't. Maybe I was just watching a movie about motorcycle riders, and that's why I see that. There's a tendency for you to see in these images something you've just been exposed to. Whatever you are watching on TV will affect what you first think of, or whatever experience you've just had. But I will tell you, what matters for determining your personality here is not what you say about one image, is what you say about a bunch of different images. So they'll show you like 10 of these, and after a while they see a pattern, right? You keep talking about tough guys, about adventurous things, about danger, and then that suggests to them, when they start seeing this pattern, that maybe you are adventurous, or you are this tough guy, okay? Or you're very macho, or whatever it is. Okay, let's move on to the next image. Here's an image for the TAT. The TAT is also based on the idea that when you say something about this image, that there's something coming from within you that has to do with your personality, something from your unconscious. What you're supposed to do here with the TAT is come up with a story for this picture. You can definitely see that there's two people here, but you're supposed to make up a story. Maybe the story you make up is that there's that evil woman in the back, and she's like an evil witch who has a plan to hurt that person, that man in the front. Okay? Or maybe that looks like a woman to you, okay? The person in the front. So the story could be that there's this evil witch who plans to harm that woman in the front, okay? And the young woman doesn't know it. And why might you say that, okay? Well, it could be that it's your personality. The reason you're saying that, maybe you are paranoid. Maybe you're pessimistic. But then again, according to the test makers, it would be the pattern of when you look at several images, and it would be a pattern that they see as to how you interpret things. But people who have tested these scientifically have also said that, of course, again, it depends on what you've been exposed to. Maybe I was just watching, the Disney classic movie or animation of Snow White. Is it Snow White? I think there's several Disney movies where there's an evil woman that poisons the princess. And the one with the apple, I think is that? I forget. I haven't watched those Disney movies in a while, but I might have just watched a Disney movie, and maybe that's why I'm saying that. Maybe it says nothing about my personality at all. So these projective tests have been criticized for not being objective, right? That they're subjective. It just depends on what people say and what people interpret, what they've been exposed to. They're not reliable, and that they're not valid, but they are fun. But those who use these tests, who've been trained in how to probe the unconscious mind, defend themselves by saying that, well, only people that have been trained properly in that theoretical framework and how to use these tests and in the proper therapy that they might be using, if there is a therapy, know how to do this correctly. And when you do test just those people, then their interpretations tend to be more consistent. More about personality assessment. Your personality assessment can also be done through a clinical interview. And that's just like what it sounds. It's an interview where you sit down with someone, a clinical psychologist, and they ask you a bunch of questions about, what's your name, who you are, who are your parents, all sorts of questions. They ask you about your past, your present, your relationships, whether you're married, what your relationship is like, a whole bunch of things. But they also observe you. They'll observe, for instance, if you are well-groomed or how you're dressed. They'll observe your posture. They'll observe, for instance, the way you speak. If you speak in a low volume or with high volume, whether you seem assertive or not, those things like that. They'll assess your feelings. They'll look and see, determine if you're feeling sad or happy, and they'll ask you about your feelings. They'll try to determine your attitudes by asking you. Your perceptions, they'll ask you about what something looks like. They might show you an image, say, what does this look like to you? To determine if perhaps maybe you are paranoid, or maybe you are hallucinating or something like that. Like I said, they'll make note of your appearance, your posture. So they ask you about a bunch of things, and they notice a bunch of things. Okay, and this could take an hour or more. Okay, and an example of a clinical interview is the mental status examination. It's used by clinical psychologists, and they do all those bunch of things. Okay, so it's a very detailed observation. Not just an observation, it's a very detailed interview. What's good about these clinical interviews, or the strengths, is that they are very focused. They do focus on several things. They ask you about a lot of different things, and it's a very detailed, multi-method assessment. So they use a variety of methods. They use questionnaires, right? They observe you. They also might test you and have you fill something out. They might give you a test to see if you, a memory test or something like that. So they use multiple methods to assess you. They assess your behavior, your thinking, your feelings. They observe you. They have you do self-reports. It's a multi-pronged assessment, and that's a very good thing, okay? Because if you have multiple types of assessment, all telling you more or less the same thing, that maybe this person's paranoid, maybe this person's aggressive, then that might actually be the case, because you have evidence from several different areas, several different methods telling you the same thing. Weaknesses. The assessment can be a little bit subjective based on the theoretical orientation of the person who's giving you the interview. If the person is a Freudian, that's been trained in Freudian psychoanalysis, Freudian theory, then they're going to interpret things differently. If the person's been trained in social learning theory, then it'll be a totally different interpretation. I will point out, in case it isn't obvious already, that there is no perfect method of assessment. There is no perfect, method of doing research. They all have weaknesses, okay? There is no perfect study. There is no such thing as perfection. There's only approximations. And that's why we need multiple assessments, multiple studies to really tell us that something is happening. More about personality assessment. There's also behavioral assessment. Here they focus specifically on the behavior, and they have a checklist. And they might check off that the person, for instance, is laughing, or the person is talkative, or the person seems distracted, or something like that. They'll check things off as they see them. An example would be the Easy Temperament Survey. Another one of these surveys that basically, another assessment that has been developed and can be purchased and has been thoroughly tested, okay, and is just very scientifically rigorous, that you have to pay for, by the way. Another one of these assessments, okay, that is scientifically based, okay, that is science-based. So that's an example, okay? They rate your emotionality, so how emotional you are, how active you are, how social you are, and how impulsive you are. And that's why it's called the Easy Temperament Survey, because take the first word of each of those, first letter of each of those words, and it spells easy. There are many other behavioral assessments, but basically, you kind of check things off, or you rate things as you see them, and you tend to, you're looking for behavior, okay, for the most part. Strengths, you observe a variety of behaviors. It focuses on several things. Weaknesses, again, observer bias, okay? The interpretation could be biased based on the person's theoretical orientation. We'll keep going. There's also thought sampling. Okay, thought sampling. Some of these things I've written here are outdated, but I leave them on there just so you can know how it used to be done, and I'll tell you now that it can be done much more easily than that. But thought sampling is just that. They sample your thoughts. So they will, every now and then, they'll contact you, and they'll ask you, what are you thinking right now? Please write it down, or please record it. Or how are you feeling right now? Or what are you doing right now? Okay, so the person's thoughts, feelings, and behaviors are self-reported over a period of time. In the past, they used to use pagers. They used to page you. A lot of you may not know what that is anymore. Or they used to beep you. People used to have these phones and they would beep when somebody would contact you, or they page you or something. They provide you with some kind of signal telling you, okay, record your thoughts right now. Record whatever you're thinking now, or however you're feeling now, or whatever you're doing right now. Nowadays, of course, we can do that on a smartphone or on a tablet. In the past, they used to do it also by calling people on a regular phone where all you could do is talk, and they tell them, please record what you're thinking right now. So an example, recording your positive and negative experiences for 2 weeks. They might do it over for a period of 2 weeks or maybe a period of months. And what they're trying to do here, the aim is to provide a sample of your thoughts, your feelings, and behavior to see a pattern over time. And if you do record your thinking, your behavior, and your feelings over time, you can do that yourself. You will learn about yourself. You will learn that you tend to be maybe a very pessimistic person, or maybe angry, or maybe you're always doing certain things and you have OCD or something like that. It can reveal a lot about your behavior and who you are. Strengths, what's good about this real-time assessment. So they actually are recording, they ask you to record things when they're happening, okay? And you can uncover difficult material. You can find things out that you maybe weren't even aware of, okay? Weaknesses, problems, is people will often fail to follow instructions or follow directions. They will not often record something when they're told to do so. The thing is to do it in real time. They give you some kind of signal, some kind of message, a text message. Please record, write down how you're feeling right now, or what you are doing right now. And maybe you don't. Maybe it's just inconvenient right now. You're eating and you don't want to stop eating. Or you're watching a show and you don't want to stop watching it. Or maybe you're going to the bathroom. Or maybe you're taking a shower, or you're having sex. You don't want to do it. You don't want to stop what you're doing and do it right now. And there are problems if the thoughts are recorded later. If you do it later, then you've kind of lost the kind of real-time experience there, and things won't feel the same way later on. Your feelings will have changed. Your thoughts can have changed. And you, of course, could be doing something else. Or maybe you don't want to write down what you're doing. You want to really write down that you're having sex or something like that, or that you're going to the bathroom, right? So those are all problems. Okay, let's keep going. Now let's talk about quality assessment. How do you know if you have a good assessment, right? So we have to know of a couple of things so we know that our measure, our assessment, whatever we want to call it, is actually a good one, okay? So quality assessment requires standardization, that's one thing. It requires reliability and validity. Those are three different things that I'm going to talk about. First thing, standardization. Standardization just means that you make things consistent. You make it the same for everybody, okay? So standardization is consistency of conditions and procedures of assessment. If you're going to standardize your personality test, for instance, that means that it's the same test that everyone gets. Everyone gets the same test with the same questions or the same items, right? Everyone gets the same test. Everyone is given the same instructions, the same clear instructions. Everyone gets the same amount of time to complete the test, and everyone should take the test in a similar environment. Hopefully in a place that's quiet, okay, free from distraction, you know, and during a time that, you know, when you can focus, okay, when you actually have the time. So you're trying to standardize it. If the conditions vary, that will compromise performance. If you take the test, let's say, and you only get half an hour when you take the test the first time, and then the second time you get an hour, then obviously the scores can differ. And then that will compromise comparison, okay? That will compromise your score. Which one's the real score, okay? Or if when you take the test once, it's quiet and you can focus, and then the other time, you're very distracted because there's construction going on outside and somebody's using that jackhammer, okay, or something like that. Think about like when you're taking the SAT or some other standardized test, let's say for school, and there's a bunch of noise outside because of construction. And maybe you take it another time, and this time you're able to focus and it's quiet, and then you do better the second time. Well, all that compromises, the quality of the assessment, okay? It's not standardized if things vary. So we need to make it consistent. We need to make it the same for everyone. Same test, same time, same instructions, same conditions as much as we can. So that if there's any variation, well, it shouldn't be due to your personality, okay? We'll talk about that in a moment. Okay, actually, we'll talk about this during reliability. Another thing about the test is not only does it have to be standardized, it's also that the test has to be reliable. A test that is that has been standardized is more likely to be reliable. Okay, these things are related. Reliability means that that you get consistent responses from the device that you're using. The test that you're using gives you consistent responses. So if you take the test the first time, you get a certain score, and you take the test a second time, let's say on a different day, you should get a similar score if the test is reliable. And remember that that you're more likely to have a similar score if you've standardized the test. If everyone gets the same test, same time, same instructions, okay? But reliability is a different thing of its own. Reliability means that you get a similar score every time you take the test. So reliability is actually measured with correlation, with the correlation coefficient we called R. Hopefully you remember something from maybe a Psych 101 class. Actually, I believe that this class might not require Psych 101 as a prerequisite, but correlation coefficient is a measure of consistency. If you have a high positive correlation, it means the test is reliable. It means the first time you took the test and the second time you took the test, you got similar scores. Okay, so one type of reliability is test-retest reliability, okay? You take the test twice, right? 2 different times, and you get a similar score. And that means when you do the correlation, when you compute the correlation between the scores of the first test and the scores of the second test, you will have a high positive correlation, a correlation near 1. You can do equivalent forms of the test, okay? So you can have a version of the test, different versions of the test that ask slightly different questions that written in slightly different ways, but they ask about the same things. And you need to determine that that test is reliable, that people score similarly when they take the test at different times. So you can test, that test, you can have them take it once, take it twice, take the second form of the test, and then compute the correlation. If the correlation is near 1, if it's a high positive correlation, again, that means the test is reliable. You can also split the test in half and have a split and test the split half reliability. Compare the first set of questions on the test with the second half of the questions. So let's say it's 100 questions on the test, right? Compare the scores for the first half with the scores for the second half. Or you can do odd even. You can compare the odd with the even, okay? You can do that. I do actually do something similar when I have tests for a large class, like my 101 class. Like when we met face to face, I couldn't have everybody taking the same test. Everyone's sitting right next to each other. So I created different forms of the test with a different order of questions, so to make it harder to cheat. And I tested basically the reliability to make sure that people score similarly on those 2 different versions of the test. So you check the reliability to ensure that participants get similar scores if they should take the test at different times. And something that's a little bit harder to understand is validity. You need to make sure that your test is valid, okay? Validity is the extent to which the assessment, the measure, actually, let me use the word assessment, the extent to which the assessment actually measures what it's intended to measure. So a personality test really does measure personality if it's valid. Or an intelligence test really does measure intelligence if it's valid. Okay, these things don't just apply to personality, they apply to any kind of test, okay? So again, what you want is you want a high positive correlation. That would indicate good validity, okay? And there are several ways to determine validity. There's actually like 6 different ways. I'm only gonna tell you about 3 of them. So there's predictive validity. Predictive validity means that the test, actually the scores on the test actually predict something useful, some future behavior. So for instance, you might take a test on the need for achievement. Need for achievement test is a test that measures basically, well, just the extent to which you want to succeed and do well. Let's say you take that test and you score high on that test. Well, that should also indicate that you should be successful in college, that you should get high grades, for instance. That would mean that the test actually predicts maybe college test scores or college grades or things like that. That's predictive validity. Or if you have a test of aggressive behavior and someone scores really high on that test, we can predict that that person is more likely to get into fights later on, more likely to have problems in school with behavior, and perhaps even more likely to end up in jail. That's predictive validity, okay? And when it comes to predicting things, just as an aside, I can tell you that there's something that predicts a lot of things, and that's income. Income is so important for so many things. It predicts so many different things. But I can tell you there are a lot of different things predicting as well, like intelligence, you know, and also your personality. But a good test, a test that is valid, that actually measures something, that it's trying to measure something it intends to measure, should actually be able to predict something that's actually useful, okay? Something like that, something useful. Content validity is the extent to which a test, which the test items, the questions relate to what it is trying to measure. Content validity means that basically when you look at the questions of the test is actually measuring things that actually have to do with what the test is trying to measure. So let's say you have a need for achievement test, right? You take a test. The questions on that test actually relate to success and wanting to do well and things like that. It asks you questions about those things. Or an intelligence test actually asks you questions that relate to intelligence. A math test actually has math questions. That test has content validity. The content seems to be measuring the right thing, okay? And here's another type of validity that's harder to understand. Construct validity. Construct validity means that has to do with how well a test actually measures a construct or a theoretical component of behavior. And it's the word construct that throws people off. A construct is like a construction, something that has been created, like a theory. A lot of things are constructs or theoretical. Believe it or not, intelligence is a construct. It is something that we have named and created that we assume is real, but we can't really touch it. It's hard to determine, it's hard to see, but we created this term for it. We created this construct, and that we assume exists, okay? We assume it's something real, and we try to define it, we try to measure it. I'll tell you something else, just to you understand the word construct, okay? The term race, right, is a construct, okay? It is something that people created, and they decided to give it a name to differentiate among people. And if you study race scientifically, you'll find out that it's actually completely useless. It is a completely useless construct. Ethnicity is more of a useful construct. That is more valid, right? Race has more to do with just your appearance and your skin color and things like that, and is actually a completely useless construct, but is used, of course, for things that it shouldn't be used for and affects your outcomes in society, you know, but it should not. It's actually something that's completely fake. We don't fall into these neat little categories of black, white, Asian, Latino. we are much more diverse than that as a human species, as you know, as humanity. We are much more diverse than that, and a lot of people don't fit neatly into those constructs. Race is a construct. It is an artificial construct. It was created, but a lot of things are. We've named a lot of things. Self-esteem is a construct, right? It's how we feel about ourselves, but it's something we have to define to try to measure it. But it's not something we can actually touch, but it is something we can try to study. Some of these constructs are valid and some of them are not so valid. And when you have a personality measure or test, you can also check the extent to which it is valid, okay? The extent to which it has construct validity. So let's say you have a personality test and it measures neuroticism. Neuroticism is the extent to which you worry easily, the extent to which you experience negative emotions easily. So you take this test of neuroticism and you score high on this test of neuroticism. Well, that should also mean that you score high on, let's say, a test of anxiety, because neuroticism relates to anxiety, or a test of rumination. Rumination is when you basically, you dwell on negative thoughts. So if you score high on that one test of neuroticism, you should also score high on other tests of other constructs or theories or things that are theoretically related. I know that one's a little bit harder to understand, but that's what it is, okay? The test, your score on that test should correlate, you should have a high positive correlation with other measures that are related. Let's keep going, and I don't know how far I am because I probably need to go a little bit faster because I can't see the slide number. Okay, there's different approaches to personality, and I'll go a little bit faster because you probably heard about this before. Different approaches to doing research, okay? And this is stuff kind of like from 101. Maybe you haven't heard the word idiographic, but the idiographic approach is when you study, it's an intensive study of a small number of people or a group or maybe a single individual. Maybe you haven't heard of the word idiographic, but a perfect example of that is the case study, which if you've taken 101, which Psych 101, which most of you have, you remember the case study is basically a study, a detailed study of a single individual, okay? It obtains data from a variety of sources. A case study might involve, you know, asking questions, observations, giving tests, things like that. So a case study is when you study one person in detail. And that's exactly what Freud did. Freud studied people and treated people on a one-on-one basis. He did not really do research. He didn't give out questionnaires to a bunch of people. He didn't do experiments. He did case studies. Okay, he interviewed them. He used his free association techniques, his dream analysis techniques, his other therapeutic techniques, and then he tried to understand the person and try to determine how to best treat that person. So focus on one person at a time in a very detailed way, okay? Strengths about this approach is that it's very detailed. You get a lot of information about that one person you study, and very insightful, okay? You gain a lot of insight into the person. Weaknesses, theoretical bias. Who's doing the case study? What is their training? That's gonna affect basically their interpretations. It can be subjective again. The reports can be subjective again. That again has to do with bias based on the theoretical interpretation. And some things are hard to measure. There's some things that are hard to do a case study with, okay? You know, it's hard to ask about, for instance, things that, you know, people may not remember, okay? Or to determine things about their, you know, especially things about the past, okay? Or ask them about things that they have no idea what you're asking about, especially if you're, let's say, studying children. Sometimes they don't understand certain things. They can't even tell you. They can't, you know, they don't know. Sometimes we don't know. That's the point. All right, moving on. There's also the nomothetic research, or the nomothetic approach, that involves studying large samples of people. All other research methods other than the case study are nomothetic. The experiment, the survey, observations, all involve studying multiple people, not focusing on one person. The case study focuses on one person. So an example of that would be an experiment. Hopefully you remember a little bit about this from Psych 101 if you took it. If not, you know, you might want to talk to me a little bit more and maybe I can give you a little bit of a review. But I'm going to go through this quickly. I usually spend like a half an hour on going over how experiments work in Psych 101. But an experiment, it says, is a systematic control study of the effect of one thing on another. In an experiment, really, you try to get at cause and effect, okay? You try to determine cause and effect, okay? So what is the effect of alcohol on aggression? So you actually try to get people drunk to see how it affects their aggressive behavior. And so in an experiment, just to tell you about the features, there is an independent variable. There is a variable that is manipulated. There is something that you vary. Like you can vary the amount of alcohol. Some people can get like you know, a high amount of alcohol to get them drunk. And some people can get, let's say, zero alcohol or maybe a placebo, okay? Something that will not get them drunk. So you give different amounts of a certain substance to individuals. That would be the independent variable. That is the thing that you're varying, the thing you're manipulating. The dependent variable is usually the behavior or some kind of response that you measure afterward. In that case, it would be the aggression in the example I'm giving you. Here's another way to think about it. The independent variable is the cause and the dependent variable is the effect, the thing you measure afterward. Just so you can understand those two things. You will have questions on your homework that will test your ability to understand these things. The experimental group are those people that get a zero amount of the independent variable. Let me explain that again. The experimental group are those individuals that get, for instance, zero alcohol. They get zero of whatever substance you are exposing participants that you might want to expose participants to. They get zero. Zero alcohol, if you're studying alcohol. They get zero marijuana if you're studying marijuana. If you're studying the effects of exercise on, let's say, weight loss, these are the ones that get no exercise. I mean, no, I misspoke. Non-zero amount means that they get something. They get exercise. They get real alcohol. They get real marijuana. The control group are the ones that get a zero amount. I saw the word zero and then I just thought about zero. The control group is the ones that get a zero amount. So the control group gets no marijuana, no alcohol, no exercise, okay? Why do you want a control group? The control group allows us to compare with the experimental group. The experimental group are the ones that got some amount of the independent variable. They got some alcohol. They get a non-zero amount. They got some alcohol. They got some marijuana, some exercise. And you want to compare how they did with the control group, okay? You compare the level of aggression of the experimental group, let's say, with the control group. That's the experiment. Now, what are the strengths and weaknesses of an experiment? An experiment gets at cause and effect. That's what it's designed to do. That's what's good about it. You have good control of variables. Usually experiments are done in a laboratory. So you control how much alcohol people get. Or if you're studying marijuana, you control the amount of marijuana. You measure it precisely so they get the right amount to intoxicate them. You can duplicate, you know, repeat the experiment. You can verify that it works. You can do it more than once to really show that something really is happening the way you think it's happening. Okay? Several good things about an experiment. And the best thing is cause and effect. And by the way, the reason you have such good cause and effect with an experiment is because of that control, because you control things precisely. So the only thing that could have happened is that the alcohol caused the aggression. A led to B because we didn't let other things happen and we measured and controlled everything precisely. Weaknesses of an experiment, there are many. First one mentioned there is the observer effect. It's a big weakness, right? The fact that participants will change their behavior because they know that they're being observed. They know you're messing with them. They sign up for the experiment. They come in and they know you're going to be doing something to them. Okay? And because of that, they may behave differently. They may not behave aggressively because they know that you're going to be watching them. Okay? Also, artificial setting. You know, experiments are often done in a laboratory. And it can feel like being in a doctor's office or in a dentist's office. And you may not behave naturally. And because of that, it's hard to generalize from an experiment. You know, is what you found in the lab really happening in the real world? Well, the lab is very artificial and participants maybe are not behaving naturally. So maybe it doesn't really tell you anything about the real world. And that's really what you want to do with any study, by the way. You study a group of people, or maybe one, if you're doing a case study, and you want to say that this is what happens in the real world. okay? Experiments can be expensive. They can cost thousands, tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of dollars, depending on the experiment. I studied alcohol and aggression in graduate school. And I can tell you that those experiments I ran cost tens of thousands of dollars. And the whole set of studies that I was gonna do in the 5 years, because I was the one handling the whole alcohol and aggression experiment, it was like $500,000 worth of experiments. They're very expensive. It's not just equipment and alcohol. It's not just paying participants. It's also paying assistants. It's also paying the clinical psychologist to screen participants. There's a lot of people involved. There's a team of people involved. And the money adds up. The cost adds up. They're time consuming. Experiments can take months, years to complete. Simple ones might take weeks, or maybe you can do a simple one in days. But the real ones that are done, that are published, usually take months or years to complete. Other approaches, other nomothetic research approaches, other nomothetic methods. There's the correlational method. Hopefully you remember something about correlations from Psych 101. If you took it, most of you have. If you didn't, and this doesn't make sense to you, please see me, okay? Or ask me questions. Correlational method is just a method where you test the relationship between one thing and another. Or another way to say that is you determine the correlation. The correlation, if you recall from Psych 101, is measured with R. R equals something. R is a number between -1 and +1. And it tells you how things are related. So an example would be that you study the relationship between the need for achievement and job performance, okay? You study that, right? So you test subjects for the need for achievement, and then you test their job performance. And if the need for achievement test is any good, you should find that those that score high on the need for achievement also do better on that test of job performance, okay? That would be a positive correlation. A positive correlation means that high scores on one variable or one test correspond or are associated with or are related to high scores on the other test, just like that example. If you get a negative relationship, that means that high scores on one thing are related to low scores on the other. I'll give you an example of that. High scores, let's say, of aggression would be related to low scores, let's say, on teacher satisfaction. If you have a very aggressive student, you're probably also going to have a very unhappy teacher. Or high cholesterol, if you talk about something medical, high cholesterol scores are probably related to lower lifespan. Yes, high cholesterol will kill you. You're more likely to suffer a heart attack, okay? So those are relationships. Those are correlations. A positive correlation means that if one thing is high, the other thing is high. A negative correlation means that if one thing is high, the other thing is low. Oh, by the way, a positive correlation also means that if one thing is low, the other thing is low. Positive correlation means that if you score high on one thing, you score high on the other thing. If you score low on one thing, you score low on the other thing. So that's not a complete description there. There's an error there. It should also say that low scores also correspond with low scores on something else, okay? So in other words, the scores move together. They're both high or they're both low. Negative means one set of scores is high, the other one is low. Hopefully you remember that from Psych 101, because I'm not spending a ton of time on this. I usually spend like half an hour on this in Psych 101, but hopefully you remember something. More about the correlational method. Strengths about doing this kind of assessment is that it's quick and very easy and inexpensive to do. The correlational method is actually used usually with self-reports, with surveys. Okay, you have people take the surveys, you enter the data, and you can easily do a correlation in the computer. Okay, weaknesses, no cause and effect. The correlational method does not tell you about cause and effect, and people often get confused about this. Or when you hear a report about some study on the news, you know, people get this confused. A correlation only tells you that things are associated, things are related. I'll give you an example, okay? For instance, the common cold is positively related. Okay, yeah, the common cold is related to temperature. okay? When it's colder, more people get sick, okay? When the temperature is down, flu cases or common cold cases are up. That's a negative correlation, by the way. That doesn't mean that low temperatures cause the flu or that low temperatures cause the common cold. It just so happens that the virus that spreads those illnesses replicates more quickly in cold weather. And by the way, maybe the coronavirus does too. We'll see when it gets really cold if there's a spike in cases, okay? But a correlation does not mean that things cause each other. Or I'll give you another example. Research suggests that ice cream sales are related to drowning. When there's more ice cream sales, more people drown. Ice cream isn't causing people to drown. That doesn't make any sense. It's just a correlation. Ice cream sales go up during the summer, and so does drowning. Drowning also goes up during the summer because more people swim during the summer. So you can see a correlation between ice cream sales and drowning, but there's no cause and effect. And that's it, you guys. I am going to end this. I'm going to stop recording.